Do you believe that a dog's loyalty can be stronger than any suffering it has endured? Imagine an animal that was cruelly exploited and then discarded when it was no longer useful. Now, picture that same dog, wounded and betrayed by humanity, finding someone willing to give it a second chance. But what no one expected was that one day, this dog would have the opportunity to repay that kindness in a way that would change everything. This is the story of a dog who was abandoned and left to fend for itself, only to find not just a second chance, but a purpose, to protect the one who saved it. The air was thick, filled with smoke, sweat, and the metallic scent of open wounds. The warehouse was dark and dimly lit, with flickering light bulbs hanging from loose wires. Rusted metal walls muffled the roar of the crowd outside, but inside, the noise was deafening. Men in worn-out clothes shouted and cheered, betting large sums of money, their excitement rising with every brutal clash inside the makeshift arena. At the center of it all, a rusted iron fence enclosed the battleground. The concrete floor was stained dark, a mixture of dirt, sweat, and something far worse. Inside the cage, two dogs stood ready to fight until they couldn't stand anymore. Lucas was there, standing among the crowd, a stack of cash gripped between his fingers. He watched the scene unfold with cold, indifferent eyes. To him, this wasn't cruelty, it was a game, a way to make quick money and feel the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had seen countless fights before. Dogs thrown against each other, trained to be ruthless, to attack without hesitation. Lucas never cared. He wasn't a cruel man, but he also wasn't the type to waste time thinking about suffering. These animals were just tools, for the organizers, for the gamblers. And that night, he had placed a big bet. The dog he had wagered on was named Brutus, a strong, muscular pit bull, his body marked with scars from previous fights. His eyes weren't those of a natural killer but of a creature that had no choice, conditioned to obey. Lucas didn't see that. He only saw a champion, a dog that had won him money before. The fight began, and the crowd erupted in deafening shouts. Lucas clenched his fists, his pulse pounding as the dogs lunged at each other, snarling, fighting for survival. Brutus held his ground, fought back, defended himself. But something was different that night. His opponent was bigger, faster, more brutal. Brutus tried to strike, but each attack left him more exhausted. Lucas felt a tight knot form in his stomach, not out of concern for the dog, but at the growing possibility of losing his bet. The cheers of the crowd turned into frustrated yells. "Come on, Brutus. Get up." But Brutus couldn't anymore. His battered body refused to respond. One final blow, and he collapsed onto the concrete, panting heavily, blood dripping from his jaw. Lucas exhaled sharply, shutting his eyes for a brief moment. "Damn it," he muttered, frustration boiling inside him. He had lost money, that was all that mattered to him. Across the cage, Brutus' handler shook his head in disgust. "He's useless now," he growled, lighting a cigarette. Without an ounce of emotion, he signaled to his assistants. "Dump him." The men grabbed Brutus by the collar and dragged his limp body toward the exit. The dog didn't fight back, didn't resist. He simply accepted his fate, as if he already knew what awaited him. Lucas watched, expressionless. What happened to Brutus next wasn't his concern. That was how things worked. Winners were valuable. Losers were forgotten. He let out a breath, pulled out a cigarette, and lit it as he walked away from the warehouse. His only thoughts were about how he would recover his losses. What he didn't know was that, in just a few moments, his life would take an unexpected turn. Lucas stepped out of the warehouse with heavy strides, kicking a loose stone as he lit another cigarette. The smoke curled into the cold night air, disappearing into the darkness. His jaw was tight, and he clenched the cigarette between his teeth, trying to contain his frustration. Another night lost. Another bet down the drain. The biting wind cut through the empty streets, carrying the muffled echoes of the voices still raging inside the warehouse. The dim yellow glow of the streetlights flickered every few seconds, casting eerie shadows on the graffiti-covered walls and overturned trash cans. A dark alley loomed nearby, a black void that seemed ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to enter. The stench of sewage and dampness lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the path Lucas was walking. He exhaled sharply, blowing out a cloud of smoke. This is starting to eat me alive. Lucas had never cared about making an honest living. Gambling was the shortcut, the easy way, fast money with little effort. But lately, luck seemed to have abandoned him. Every night was another loss, and each failure weighed heavier on his conscience. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was the feeling of being stuck in an endless cycle, one he couldn't escape. Freakin' Brutus. He muttered under his breath, kicking an empty can. But as soon as the words left his mouth, a pang of guilt hit his chest. This wasn't the dog's fault. He hated himself for even thinking that way. How many times had he sat in those filthy bleachers, cheering for a fight like it was just another game? How many times had he ignored the pain in the animal's eyes, laughing and betting without a second thought? For the first time, he felt disgusted with himself. And then, something caught his eye. Under the weak flickering glow of a streetlight, a dark figure lay motionless on the curb. Lucas slowed his steps, squinting to get a better look. As he approached, his stomach twisted into a tight knot. It was Brutus. The dog lay sprawled in the gutter, unmoving. His fur, matted with dried blood and grime, was tangled and thick with dirt. His breathing was shallow, labored, his chest barely rising and falling, as if every breath was a struggle. Lucas froze. This was the same dog that had fought with everything he had just hours ago. The same dog Lucas had placed his bet on without a second thought. And now, he was discarded like garbage. His heart pounded harder. He swallowed against the lump in his throat, something burning in his chest. For the first time, he didn't see a fighting dog. He saw an injured, broken animal, abandoned, left to die alone. Slowly, he crouched down, feeling the chill of the concrete seep through his jeans. Brutus. He called, his voice rough, almost hesitant. The dog barely opened his eyes. There was no fire left in them, no defiance. He didn't growl, didn't try to move. He had already given up. A sharp pain twisted inside Lucas, something unfamiliar. How many dogs had suffered the same fate? How many had he personally helped send to their deaths without even blinking? The weight of it all crashed down on him like a tidal wave. "I'm a damn coward," he muttered, running a hand down his face. He glanced around. No one. Brutus was alone. He could walk away. Just keep going, pretend he never saw him. That's what he always did. That's what they all did. But this time, something inside him refused to let him turn his back. Lucas pulled off his jacket and, with careful hands, wrapped it around Brutus. The dog didn't resist. He was too weak. As Lucas lifted him into his arms, he felt the dog's weight, the faint warmth of his body barely noticeable against the freezing wind. "You're still hanging in there, buddy," he murmured, holding Brutus close to shield him from the cold. He looked up at the dark sky. Maybe this was his chance to change something. Taking a deep breath, Lucas turned around and started walking. This time, he wouldn't leave Brutus behind. Lucas had never cared for anyone but himself. But that night, as he carried Brutus home in his arms, he felt like he owed a debt, not of money, but of something far greater, redemption. When he walked through the door, his wife, Amelia, shot up from the couch in alarm. "Lucas, what is that?" she gasped, staring at the battered dog he held. In the doorway of her bedroom, their 6-year-old daughter, Amy, peeked out, her big eyes filled with curiosity and concern. I couldn't just leave him there, Lucas murmured, struggling to find the right words. He didn't want to say where he'd been or how Brutus had ended up like this. None of that mattered now. All that mattered was saving him. He hurried to the living room and laid Brutus gently on the floor, gathering old blankets and towels to create a makeshift bed. Every time his fingers brushed over the dog's wounds, a knot tightened in his throat. He had seen countless dogs hurt before, but never once had he cared. This time, it was different. The next morning, Lucas took Brutus to the vet. The doctor gave him a long, skeptical look as he examined the deep cuts and bruises covering the dog's body. "He's been through hell, hasn't he?" the vet said, his voice heavy with unspoken questions. Lucas lowered his gaze, ashamed. "It doesn't matter where he's been. I just want him to live." The vet let out a quiet sigh before getting to work. The treatment process was grueling: antibiotics, warm baths to clean the dirt and grime, dressings that had to be changed over and over. Lucas stayed by Brutus's side through it all, watching every breath, every wince, waiting for a sign that the dog still had the strength to fight. The first few days were rough. Brutus barely moved, barely ate. His trust in humans was shattered, and he couldn't understand why the same species that had once hurt him was now trying to save him. But slowly, something shifted. Lucas started feeding him by hand, speaking to him in a low, steady voice, as if he were trying to convince not just Brutus, but himself, that he had changed. "I know I failed you, buddy, but give me a chance." And then, one day, it happened. Brutus wagged his tail. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But to Lucas, it meant everything. As the days passed, Brutus began to explore the house. At first, he struggled just to drag himself toward the kitchen, where Amelia would watch him warily. Later, he started following Lucas out onto the porch, lying at his feet while he sipped his coffee, lost in thought. And then, he found Amy. At first, the little girl was hesitant. "He won't bite, right, Daddy?" she asked, gripping her father's arm. Lucas knelt beside her, holding her tiny hand in his. "No, sweetheart. He just needs to know he's safe now." Amy, with all the innocence of a child, extended her hand slowly. Brutus hesitated, his nose twitching as he sniffed her fingers. Then, ever so gently, he licked her palm. Amy gasped, then giggled. "He likes me." And just like that, Brutus found his place in the family. At first, Amelia had been reluctant about letting a scarred, traumatized dog into their home. But as time passed, even she softened. Brutus, once a creature who had known nothing but pain, now had warm meals, soft blankets, and a place where he truly belonged. Lucas watched all of this unfold with a tightness in his chest. Every small victory Brutus achieved felt like a victory for him, too. It was as if, in helping the dog heal, he was also healing himself, patching up wounds he hadn't even realized he carried. One night, after Amelia and Amy had gone to bed, Lucas sat by the fireplace, watching Brutus doze beside the warmth. He reached out, running a hand over the dog's thick fur. "You're strong, buddy," he murmured. "Stronger than I've ever been." Brutus lifted his head and pressed his snout into Lucas's hand. There was no more fear in his eyes. Only trust. Lucas took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had finally done something right. The night was calm. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m., and the house was wrapped in a comfortable silence. Outside, the cold wind rustled through the dry leaves, making them dance across the yard. From the bedroom, Lucas could hear Amelia's steady breathing as she slept beside him. The only other sound was the faint ticking of the clock and the distant flickering of the streetlights on the deserted road. In the living room, near the now extinguished fireplace, Brutus lay resting, but never fully asleep. Even now, with the warmth of a home and the comfort of a family, his instincts remained sharp. Then, he heard something. A sound so subtle it could have been mistaken for the wind. A faint rustling outside. Soft, measured footsteps pressing into the grass. Ears twitching, Brutus opened his eyes and raised his head. Something was wrong. The silence that once felt peaceful now seemed suspicious. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air. There was a scent he didn't recognize. It wasn't Lucas. It wasn't Amelia. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a stranger. His muscles tensed, and he rose slowly, moving soundlessly across the room. The sound grew closer, shuffling footsteps near the back door. Then, a metallic click. Someone was trying to break in. A deep, low growl rumbled in Brutus's throat, quiet but threatening. But he didn't lunge, not yet. He waited. His sharp eyes locked onto the front door as the handle twisted ever so slightly. Then, everything happened at once. The door was forced open with a violent crash. Lucas jolted awake, his heart pounding. Amelia let out a muffled scream, covering her mouth with her hands. In the next room, little Amy curled under her blankets, frightened. The intruder, a hooded man, stepped inside without hesitation, scanning the house for valuables. But he wasn't expecting Brutus. The roar that tore through the house was deafening. Brutus lunged like a bolt of lightning. The intruder barely had time to react before the massive pit bull crashed into him, knocking him to the ground with brutal force. The man struggled, kicking and thrashing, but Brutus locked onto his arm, pinning him down with a grip like steel. He didn't bite to injure, just enough to ensure the man wouldn't escape. A clear warning, move, and things would get worse. Lucas stumbled out of the bedroom, still processing the chaos unfolding before him. "Don't move," he shouted, grabbing his phone. His fingers fumbled as he tried to dial. Amelia, shaking, snatched the phone from his hands and quickly pressed the emergency number. "Someone broke into our house. Our dog stopped him." The intruder, now completely immobilized, stared up at Brutus with pure terror. He tried to shift, but the dog's growl cut through the air, freezing him in place. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights flooded the street. Officers stormed into the house and handcuffed the man, hauling him away as Lucas tried to catch his breath. He turned to Brutus. The dog stood firm, muscles still tense, eyes sharp as if waiting for another attack. His chest rose and fell rapidly, but he remained alert, unwilling to let his guard down. That's when it hit Lucas. Brutus, the dog who had once been abandoned and discarded, had just saved them all. Amelia knelt beside him, running a trembling hand over his head, her eyes glistening. "My God, he protected us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Lucas crouched beside Brutus, their eyes meeting. The dog remained still, waiting for a command, waiting for reassurance. Lucas placed a firm hand on his fur and murmured, "You saved us, buddy." Brutus finally relaxed. His tense body softened, and he rested his head against the floor, exhausted but victorious. From the hallway, Amy, who had been watching with wide eyes, ran toward Brutus without hesitation. She threw her little arms around his thick neck, burying her face in his fur. "My hero," she whispered. Lucas looked at his wife, his daughter, and then at the dog who was now so much more than a pet. He was a protector. A guardian. A true part of their family. Swallowing hard, Lucas felt something shift inside him. If he had ever doubted it before, now he knew, he needed this dog just as much as Brutus needed him. The days following the incident felt different. Lucas sensed it in everything, the way he looked at his home, his wife and daughter, and most of all, Brutus. Before, he had always believed his life was destined to follow a reckless path, trapped in gambling, impulsive decisions, and a routine without purpose. But now, he saw everything in a new light. Brutus had risked his life for him. For his family. That thought shook Lucas in a way he never expected. If a dog, who had been betrayed by humans so many times, still had the strength to protect those he loved, then why was he, a man with every opportunity, still running from his responsibilities? Shame crept over him for the man he used to be, all the money wasted on bets, all the times he ignored the risks, all the selfish choices. He didn't want to be that person anymore. For the first time in years, he made a conscious decision to change. He started with small steps. He quit gambling. He never set foot in an illegal fight ring again. He knew that world would only drag him back into the cycle of destruction, and now, he had something far more valuable to lose. Then, he focused on being a better father and husband. He spent more time with Amy, helping her with schoolwork, taking her to the park, with Brutus always by their side. With Amelia, he learned to show more respect, to listen, to prove through actions rather than empty promises that he was trying to be a better man. He also decided to look for honest work. He no longer wanted easy money or shortcuts. The thrill of gambling had lost its appeal. What he wanted now was stability, for himself, for Amelia, for Amy, and for Brutus. At first, Amelia was skeptical. Lucas had made promises before, so many times. But as the months passed, she saw the difference. He wasn't the reckless man who once put everything at risk. He was someone who finally understood the value of the life he had. And it all started because of Brutus. The dog Lucas had once seen as just another bet had become the symbol of his transformation. When he looked at Brutus, he saw a reflection of himself, someone who had been lost, discarded, but was given a second chance. And Lucas chose to hold on to that chance with everything he had. One evening, sitting on the porch with Brutus resting at his feet, Lucas picked up a ball and tossed it across the yard. Brutus perked up his ears and ran after it, bringing it back with his tail wagging. Lucas chuckled and ran his hand over the dog's head. "You changed me, buddy," he said softly. Brutus simply looked at him, as if he understood. Lucas took a deep breath, gazing up at the starlit sky. He had never imagined that one day he would feel at peace. But now, sitting next to the dog who had saved his life in so many ways, he knew, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Brutus had been trained to fight for his life, but he found a purpose far greater, protecting those who loved him. Lucas, in turn, learned that some bonds are forged in the most unexpected moments. He had once placed a bet on Brutus in the ring, but it was in real life that the dog truly proved his worth. That night, in that home, a debt was repaid, not with money, but with something far more valuable, loyalty. If you've followed the story this far, give it a like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.